Hey there, and welcome back to another installment of the Offset Podcast. And today, we're taking a look at the state of monitors in 2025. Stay tuned.
This podcast is sponsored by Flanders Scientific, leaders in color-accurate display solutions for professional video. Whether you're a colorist, an editor, a DIT, or a broadcast engineer, Flanders Scientific has a professional display solution to meet your needs. Learn more at flandersscientific.com.
Hey, everybody, welcome back to another installment of the Offset Podcast. I am Robbie Carmen, and with me, as always, is Joey Deanna. Joey, how you doing, buddy?
Good, how are you?
I am good, man. Spring is in the air. I'm wearing pink. I'm feeling like it's monitor season. You know, every spring I sort of start to feel like it's monitor season for a couple reasons. One, it's kind of like trade show season, you know, so like everybody's going to big trade shows and talking about monitors. And it just seems like, you know, post the holidays and, you know, the start of a new year, everybody's like, hey, what's my big purchase going to be this year? And it's probably a reference monitor, right? That is something that colorists and DITs and stuff are always thinking about. And so I wanted to spend this episode talking a little bit about, I don't know, the state of affairs of monitors. I think we went through a period for a couple of years where things were really kind of like flat, kind of boring. It was clearly that like everybody was doing kind of stopgap things. And to a certain degree, I think we're probably still in that zone. But I wanted to talk about monitors. But here's the thing, man, is that you and I can flap all we want about monitors and SDI connections and contrast ratios. But the fact is that we have some very, very smart friends who are experts in this field and know quite a bit more than we do about this. So today we thought we'd have a little bit of a special episode. This is going to be part one of a two-part series kind of exploring the state of affairs on monitors. And we are lucky to be joined by these three gentlemen. Hi, guys. How are you? Let me introduce everybody. First of all, we have Bram Desmet from FSI. Bram. Actually, you and Nate, who I'll introduce in a second, have the honor of being our only return guests. That's because we've only had two guests before, both of you. So, well, congratulations for being return guests. We have Bram Desmet from FSI, who is the CEO and general manager down there. He is a guru of all things display manufacturing, process, technology of displays, that kind of stuff. We have Nate McFarland from Dolby. Hey, Nate, how are you, man?
Doing well.
Nate is a engineer, validator, jack of all trades over at Dolby Labs. He explores, you know, if the proof is in the pudding with monitors. He does a lot of training and, you know, part of the certification process for Dolby. For those of you who want to become Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos certified, that's kind of Nate's, you know, area of expertise. And he is my go-to person for any time I have a question about, you know, hey, is this a good purchase to buy? What do you think? Is the truth here? And so he'll have some good perspectives about monitors from Dolby's perspective and validation and that kind of stuff. And then we also have David Abrams. David is how am I going to say this? I think David is like the guru among gurus when it comes to calibration. If you talk to pretty much any post-production or facility or any colorist, they will know David's name and his calibration company, AvaCal. And David also is now at Portrait Displays. David came out with a awesome application. What was that, David? Probably about 3 or 4 years ago, you released your app.
Patterns.
Yeah,
Patterns test generator.
Yeah, so Patterns is a very cool application to be able to interface and do calibration on computer monitors, displays. It's a very cool app. We'll let him talk about it a little bit more in detail in just a bit. But David's expertise is obviously with anything calibration. He's probably, I mean, I'm guessing, David, at this point, you've probably calibrated 100,000 displays or something ridiculous. It's probably a lot, right?
It's about, I actually had to look this up at some point. It's about 25,000.
Oh my gosh! So if anybody's going to have the experience and who's sort of seen it and done it and seen all the gotchas is David. So guys, we can't thank you enough for jumping on. We're really excited to sort of talk about some of this stuff, and so I want to spend just kind of a couple minutes with each one of you, and then, like I said, in part two of this series, we'll come back and kind of explore some of the hot button topics, things that are on our minds that you guys are experts in. So Bram, let's start with you, man. I'll put you on the spot. I think when I think of your expertise, I often think about all of the I don't know, probably at this point, thousands of hours that you've spent in conference rooms, at show, at big trade shows, listening to monitor presentations. And I'm not talking about like the marketing people. I'm talking about like the Uber engineer guys who are talking about like subpixels and quantum this and quantum that, right? I guess my first question for you is, as a monitor, provider maker, what goes into picking technologies and panels and stuff, and kind of how do you stay on top of that? Like, because it seems like it's an ever shifting, ever developing kind of landscape.
Yeah, well, first, thanks for having me on, and really appreciate what you guys are doing. And yeah, it's always a challenge. So what we do is we have good contacts at various semiconductor manufacturers, so the big companies that make the panels themselves. So we have ongoing relationships with those. So a lot of that is just relationships that have been built over the last 20 years and having
Yeah.
those discussions about what they're working on, their future roadmaps. There's other, like any industry, there's also trade shows and organizations that kind of cater to our very niche kind of needs. So one that we try to go to, for example, or I personally go to, is SID's Display Week. At SID's Display Week, and that event essentially brings together those semiconductor manufacturers, probe manufacturers. It's kind of a level removed from this type of stuff, I think, that colorists, editors, DITs
Yeah.
were interested in, because it's not complete products. But it is a good opportunity to meet with those companies, talk to them about what they're doing. Obviously, a lot of this happens overseas, so this is one of the few kind of events that happens more stateside. And then just a lot of industry trade stuff, press releases. We try to keep on top of what everybody is making and how technologies are evolving. You oftentimes get really excited about things on paper, and they get really disappointed when you evaluate them. So we do a lot of evaluation, a lot of rejection of technologies. So yeah, it's a kind of ongoing, ever evolving process, and it's a kind of a full-time job.
Yeah, I was gonna say, do you have, as a display manufacturer and being more in the know than we are, do you struggle with having to wade through a lot of the marketing part of this as well? Like, because it just seems to me that, like, one of the challenges for, our audience as colorists, editors, etc., is like, a company will come out and be like, hey, this is the ultra quantum, doohickey, and it sounds revolutionary, right? But like, do you have to wade through that same level, or when you're evaluating displays, is it more of like, no, we get rid of that, we're just dealing with the engineering part of it?
So I think we've learned enough over, I've been in this industry about 20 years now, and we've learned enough about evaluating specifications even just on paper, and we can quickly wade through a lot of the marketing BS and know what we can expect out of a display technology based on things like the reported specifications or reported spectral power distribution. Sometimes we can get access to that information, but there's a lot of marketing hype to wade through. It's not so much the marketing hype is easy for us to kind of suss out what's real, what's again, hype.
Yeah, sure.
The harder thing for me, and the thing that frustrates me more, is misuse of terminology, or giving things names that are intentionally very confusing.
You mean LED TVs?
LED TVs, calling things, very similarly named things like tandem primary, this and that, and versus regular tandem OLED.
Well, I gotta say, I was really disappointed when I bought a quantum dot television that I like didn't get entangled and like, all of a sudden just start seeing. I don't know, that's a bad joke, but you get the idea.
No, it's true. So some of those naming conventions and stuff can be confusing. So that's always a challenge, but I think we've gotten pretty good at sussing those things out. And ultimately what it comes down to is buy samples, test the product, see if we think there's a market for it. And then also try to do our due diligence on, staying power of that technology, because that's really been the biggest frustration over my last 20 years of doing this, is that you get really excited about something. And what we've seen time and again is that, unfortunately, a lot of times the best performing technologies are so niche, so expensive, that the providers of those technologies, there's not really a market here, we're going to stop. And so we've seen those instances. Sometimes it's a thing where you have 3, 4, 5 years of notice, and then sometimes it's just overnight that company's gone. So we've gotten a lot more careful about that, and luckily a lot of the mass market stuff that's produced in high quantities and tends to have staying power has gotten a lot better. So there's less of that worry now than there used to be, but that's been an ongoing frustration over the years.
Yeah, I would imagine that's a challenging kind of thing. Like, how do you, like, so you're having to read the tea leaves a little bit about, like, okay, this is what's coming, this is what's potentially going to have the same power. Like, in the broader sense, would you say that your work, your R&D work, is a couple years or a couple months? Like, what's the time period ahead that you generally are for when, like, a guy like me is buying a monitor, right? Is that a couple years? Is it a couple months? Like, does it vary?
Yeah, it does vary. So when we do like the back end hardware that drives the panels, when we do a change there, that is something that typically will be, you know, in development for a couple of years before anybody knows or sees anything about it. In terms of adopting new panel technologies, though, as long as we have a platform that supports the type of connection going to that panel, whether that's, you know, EDP or LVDS or whatever it may be at UHD, 4K, HD resolutions, whatever it is, as long as we have the back-end hardware that can fit into that, it's actually, you'd be surprised how quickly we can get a prototype ready. So we can get a new panel and have something up and running in like 3-4 weeks. So it can go quickly. Then there's always, you know, the debugging and the fine tuning, and we're constantly iterating, trying to improve, you know, find problems, catch problems, improve on things. But it is a, you know, it's a constant evolution. But yeah, it varies a bit. But there are, you know, there are platforms that have been in the works for years that haven't seen the light of day yet. But there is a lot of that happening behind the scenes.
Yeah. That makes sense. I mean, I think it's easy to think of like a company like FSI or other monitor companies as like hardware companies, but like the fascinating thing to me is like, and I don't know if this is 100% accurate, it just seems this way to me, is that like you guys are almost more of a software company at times than you are a hardware company, right? Figuring out like functionality of this button's going to do this. This is the feature that this set of group books. Can you speak to just in general like how the process or the challenge of kind of like designing features and figuring out like, okay, this is going to be something that we think this group of, you know, our customers are going to want or need, like what goes into that thinking and the kind of like the development of that?
Yeah, so when we have new panels or new backend architecture that's developed, we take the approach of first focusing on color reproduction, color accuracy, and then also displaying video correctly. That means things like, you know, displaying whatever, you know, frame rate you're getting at an even integer frame rate on screen so that you have proper cadence of video. So we work on the basics first. We start with what most people buy a monitor from us for, and that is color accuracy and accurate display of the content on screen. Then from there, we have, you know, things that we think, a lot of times stuff that customers haven't asked for, but that we think will bring a lot of value to market. We have a lot of our own ideas about those things, and we develop those out, and we, you know, have those come out as features. But you're right, we are very much a company that focuses on, we're essentially a company that, you know, hardware is part of what we do, certainly, but a lot of our time and effort is spent on firmware. A lot of that comes from feedback from customers. And a lot of times it's just us, you know, we think we know how our displays are going to be used, and then you're oftentimes surprised. So a good kind of, I think the two real world examples of that, when we introduced the XMP series monitors, we're like, cool, we're going to focus on UHD, progressive, PQ, HLG. That's what people are going to be using these for. Then we start.
And then there's Robbie making web videos.
No, it's not web videos. It's just, but it is people like you who are like, hey, you know what? We deliver inordinate amount of interlace still, and we're like, oh crap, you know, because
for the inside baseball. One of the things that I of the many things that I drive Brom crazy with, it's the fact that I'm always saying something about interlacing, and Brom's general response is, aren't we over interlacing yet? Like, what?
Should have died a long time ago. Yeah, but it is so those types of things. So we added those as features. So that's a good example of like what I love is that yes, we build a hardware platform to do a certain thing, but that hardware platform tends to be really flexible, right? And we can do a lot with firmware. So when we got a lot of this feedback about, hey, I want to see interlaced on screen like a CRT monitor would show it, we did that. And I think we're one of the few kind of large format monitors, certainly UHD resolution monitors, that actually can replicate interlaced very much like a reference grade CRT would. So you can see things like field reversals accurately. Now, there are a lot of consumer TVs that do a good job of of converting interlaced to progressive and making it look really good. But typically those have 6-7 frames of processing delay to do that.
Right.
And ultimately, you're still not seeing it as interlaced on screen. So what we do is we're actually showing it to you as interlaced. The other good example was HD. We thought everybody was going to be using these things for UHD and just UHD and 4K, and that's it. A lot of people were like, hey, we need HD. And we were doing very basic nearest neighbor scaling, and that has jaggy edges when you do that. So what we did is we developed a higher quality bicubic scaling. So now that scaling's improved. So those are the type of things where it's just customer feedback, right? People saying, hey, these are what we think are highest priority. And then it's, like any company working on software or firmware, it's, priority list, what do we think is going to have the greatest impact to the industry? What's going to, selfishly help us sell more displays? But we're
squashing bugs, that kind of stuff.
Iterating there. And in post, they're really only a core set of things. There's not that much to tackle. So a lot of the preliminary stuff are, let's get everything ready for post, and then we start digging into catering more to those production applications, where there are a lot more of these like really niche, requests, like, hey, I want to do four images into a monitor. I want to do custom look LUTs. I want to control it via library. And so we build those things out over time to cater to more and more. I mean, we already operate in a super niche space, right? And then we cater to niche segments of this already niche space. But that's what makes us different than an off-the-shelf computer monitor or something, right? So we enjoy that. That's part of what we think makes us a little special. So that's what we spend our time and effort on.
Yeah, I mean, in part two, we'll get more into some of your prognostications on like what the industry and the future trends are. But I got one last question before we ask Nate a few ones here as well. Like, one of the things I'm fascinated by is, and this might be unique to you, but it just seems in general that I see this a lot with display companies, like that intersection of color science and that this technology too is also really interesting to me. Like, I think a lot of people who know you or have come to know you or see you at a trade show floor, like you become a resource for color science, type questions, right? And I know you spend a lot of time, studying this stuff and talking to other experts. Like, just briefly, what is that intersection like for you? Like, because obviously color science has a lot of uses, meanings, etc. But as a display manufacturer, like, why is that something that, you guys focus on so much? Is it part of that accuracy equation? Is it part of, just answering people's questions? Like, why spend so much time learning something, and being an expert in color science?
Yeah, I mean, people buy our monitors, I think, primarily for accurate color reproduction, right? That's kind of the paramount thing. And as I tell, like our sales team, for example, is like, what you're really selling people is confidence, right? So to be confident that the image is correct. So the only way to be confident that the image is correct is to really know the color science through and through. So you need to know the industry specifications. You need to know how to adhere to those specifications. You need to know how to calibrate to those specifications. And you need to understand kind of the gotchas and caveats, and because none of this is straightforward, and especially when you get to more, advanced, if you want to say, targets, like when you talk about PQ and HLG and Rec 2020 and out of monitor gamut targets and how you handle that versus, because there's multiple ways to handle it. What's the correct way to handle it? And then we also interface a lot with industry standards bodies, so we try to talk to people at SMPTE, we try to talk to people at EBU. We participate in, very nuanced niche events, like we did in December. We did a Metamerism Experts Day in the UK, and that sort of stuff is really fascinating to me on a personal level. But it also helps us, cater to our clients, because our clients have these questions, So, hey, when I'm in Rec 2020, why does it do this, or what should it be doing? Hey, when I'm in PQ, what ranges should I be operating in? All these sorts of things, right? You need to know that stuff. And then again, when it comes down to the color science part of it, the challenges like metamerism, failures, metamerism in terms of display matching, inner observer metamerism, all those sorts of things become really important. You can only understand it if you really understand the underlying color science. So that's why we're obsessed with it, and why we spend so much time trying to learn everything we can about those topics.
So now I want to talk to Nate a little bit about his perspective from Dolby as a color scientist and an engineer, because I think Dolby has a pretty unique place in the industry when it comes to displays, right? They've driven display innovation in the past, making prototypes, making new technologies, basically inventing and introducing us to what I consider to be, the biggest shift in how we encode and display an image since color, which is HDR. But at the end of the day, they don't make TVs. They don't make or sell reference monitors. They make kind of innovative technologies around the imaging space and partner with all these companies like FSI, like the consumer TV manufacturers, to kind of make sure the image is shown in the best kind of possible light. And a big part of that, I know, is testing a huge array and variety of monitors, right? I've seen pictures, and when we went to Dolby, I've seen like rooms filled with monitors of, everywhere from little ones to huge ones to prototypes to off-the-shelf consumer TVs to wackadoodle stuff that you've never even heard of. Why is it so important to test all these monitors? And tell us a little bit about what actually kind of goes into testing all of these monitors of different capabilities. How do you kind of bring it all together into, okay, I'm going to look at a monitor, this is what I'm going to look for, and this is why I'm going to look for those factors?
Yeah, sure. Happy to talk about that. And thank you guys for having me on again. I'm honored to be a returning guest. But yeah, no, to Joey's point, I think Dolby has a really cool intersection. Just as a company, it's one of the reasons why I love working here. It's that we really do sit at this really niche intersection of art and science, which is something that's very, hits home for me. I'm very passionate about, but also very cool to see how we've influenced, the change in ecosystem, and also really, really great to always see folks coming to us as a resource or, a beacon in the evangelization and education for HDR. So your question about monitors is a great one. Part of the complexity here is that we deal with things on both the creation side and also the playback side, right? So from my point of view, I work typically most frequently on the content creation side of things. So the way I typically will approach any sort of display evaluation is wearing this hat of like, hey, would this display be suitable for creating HDR content that will eventually be mastered in Dolby Vision and go downstream to a Dolby Vision device? So from a very fundamental level, it's a lot of the same sort of considerations that Bram was just speaking about, right? Things like color accuracy, luminance, performance, black level, stepping out of black, how additive is the display. And that's a lot of kind of the more scientific or numerical objective approach that I would say. But there's also a really big component of usability, right? So as these displays continue to become more accessible, more folks are reaching them and using them, but that also means that more uneducated folks, right? So people that don't have a background in color science, or maybe are getting into editing or post or VFX or things for the first time. So a lot of it's not just, hey, how accurately does this track PQ, or what are the primaries looking like? But it's like something as simple as, hey, how easy is it to like navigate the menu? How easy can you set up picture profiles and do things? And one of my close colleagues at Dolby, Timo Kunkel, and I talk about this all the time. And we say that in general, I'd say that we're getting to a spot where displays are continuously improving, which is really great for HDR accessibility, throughout the whole ecosystem, but they're coming with a lot of added complexities. And I'm sure we could talk about this a little more in the next episode as well, but I almost equate it to things like when you shoot a video or a picture on your iPhone, right? Where it's like, it's very hard to manually dial it in, and you're kind of just trusting that the software is doing the right things, right? And that's, permeated all the way to displays. And that's why reference displays like the ones that FSI make are so valuable, right? Because there are no, algorithms tweaking things. It's literally just like signal in, signal out, and being able to trust that and self-confidence, like you guys were talking about earlier, is super, super important. So that's kind of how the testing is done, or kind of the framework we typically like to use. But from also just a kind of an ecosystem, point of view, we also just like to compare different technologies, see where the industry's heading. It's very important for us to also stay up to date on informing the partners like Brahm and FSI and all these other folks of like what our users are asking for, because ultimately like Dolby has a vested interest in creating or help folks creating the best HDR content so that, you know, when you get to the end user experience, you're getting really compelling, you know, viewing experiences. So we're obviously very vested in helping our partners create the best displays as possible as well. So, and we like to hope that that's valuable. So maybe Brahm, I don't know. I like to hope that Brahm appreciates my evaluations.
Yeah.
Well, and that's interesting because I feel like you kind of have to sit between the consumer, the artist, and the manufacturers, right? Because
Sure.
the artists might be asking for one thing. I just want to do everything 100 nits the same way I've been doing it forever because I have one film print LUT that I love, and why doesn't it always look the same in HDR? Whereas, you know, the consumer TV manufacturers, and less so the professional monitor manufacturers, but to some degree, they want to kind of show off the technology and take it to, oh, you can go to 5 bajillion nits on this. How great is that? How do you kind of navigate when you're talking to both, you know, manufacturers and artists and other kind of when you're sitting in the middle of all of this, how do you kind of bring it all together and say, okay, here's how I'm going to, you know, get a set of recommendations that will kind of make everybody happy and nobody mad?
It's tough. That's very hard. So
You'll notice David and Bro both laughing at that one.
Well, this is why Nate still has hair, because he's a lot younger. This is why Dave and I are both bald now.
That's right.
no, it's a really good question, honestly. And this is something that we speak to a lot in our trainings, is that I think this whole discussion was a lot easier back, you know, a few decades ago when folks were, no matter where you were, looking at some flavor of CRT, relatively similar size, right? There's just so many formats and variability now between different display types, whether it's OLED, LCD, dual layer, you know, QD OLED, you know, there's so many different flavors of display technology, but then there's also so many form factors, right? I mean, this is something that's really cool to me about Dolby in general, is that we're not just talking about Dolby Cinema or TVs at home now. We're in, you know, iPhones, tablets, laptops, computer monitors. I mean, we have displays going into cars that are Dolby Vision enabled, which is mind blowing to me. So I think that makes it really tricky as well, right? Because not only are you introducing the variability in the technology, but also the environment. And then, you know, you have issues like ambient light, you know, viewing distance, angles, like, you know, you could go down a rabbit hole very quickly with what makes this stuff difficult. So that's why, like, when I do my evaluations, I love when I get the reference monitors in, because I'm like, this is easy. Like, these are great. This is very simple, like more cut and dry than some of the other types. But also, you know, there's applications outside of the specs, like I was saying, right? So, you know, a great, you know, TV might not make a good, you know, display to use on set or things like that. There's things like, there's so many different applications, whether it's for VFX, you know, first color, even something like a GUI monitor or, you know, a monitor on set, like they all require different, you know, physical capabilities and image quality parameters. So long-winded answer to your question is it's really tough.
So that kind of brings me to the general idea of, you know, when you look at a display or especially a consumer TV, you know, you go to the store, you buy one, it's got a little Dolby Vision badge on it. What does that actually mean on the back end? What are you getting as a consumer when you buy a television that has the official Dolby Vision badge and certification on it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, another common one we get all the time. So there's a big misconception that Dolby somehow like was instrumental in helping create or manufacture these specific displays. That's not the case. So whenever you go into any sort of retail space that sells, you know, TVs or whether it be a desktop monitor, things like that, if you see a Dolby Vision logo on the box, all that means is that display has the capability to decode and do the display mapping required by a Dolby Vision encoded signal. So if you pull up a Dolby Vision TV and you start up your Netflix, Disney Plus, whatever OTT service that supports Vision, and that specific piece of content was mastered in Dolby Vision, and you have the, you know, the according subscription model or whatever you need, that will play back on Dolby Vision, and it will automatically trigger that display's Dolby Vision mode. So it'll automatically flag it on the signal. The TV will flip into, typically speaking, it's the Dolby Vision bright mode, as it's called,
Mhm.
on most TVs. You can also then change. There's things like Dolby Vision Dark, Dolby Vision Bright. We have game modes, vivid modes, etc., for various different models. So typically speaking, the bright mode is always the default out of the box, and that's just because we're assuming that the average living room is not as well controlled ambient light wise as a grading suite.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So, staying in the consumer world for a little bit, how do you feel, in terms of the adoption and accessibility of HDR, both content and monitoring, is these days? Because I think, just a few years ago, HDR was really, really, God, we keep saying everything is niche in this episode, but
Well,
it kind of was, right?
I think you're right. I think a few years ago it seemed, and we talked about this in the episode, both episodes that we did with Brom and Nate previously. I think that for a while, HDR was a little bit of a country club ecosystem, right? It was happening at the highest end, at the highest productions, etc. And now that's trickled down, right? I think that people are
A big
people are
part of
used
this, in my opinion, is when Apple decided to make all their iPhones take photos and videos and display photos and videos in HDR by default. Right now, you have an entire swath of the consumer landscape doing their everyday, day-to-day interaction with the device, and now they're seeing HDR where they weren't seeing HDR before, and they just they don't know. The average user might not know. Hey, I shot this photo on my iPhone in HDR and I'm looking at it in HDR and it looks really good. They just know that if I have my iPhone and I take a picture with it, it looks better now. And if somebody else with an iPhone sends me a picture that they took, it looks better on this display. Is that something that is actually tangibly kind of improving and moving the industry forward, kind of having these manufacturers really put more HDR into everything? Are people adopting HDR more now than they have before, or is it still kind of that niche nerdy thing for us display geeks?
No, that's a great question, and I think the good thing is that I think you're correct in the sense that, from my point of view, and you talk to most folks at Dolby would unanimously agree that HDR is as accessible as it's ever been, and a big proponent of that, like you mentioned, is the Apple ecosystem. Obviously, they have the scale and the just raw numbers to support something like this, right? Just to give kind of like a side anecdote, a lot of the trainings I start, especially when I'm doing trainings for folks that are maybe newer to HDR, not as well versed, think of like universities, education partners, things like that. Whenever I'm in person, I like to do, one of the first questions I'll ask is like, hey, who here has, knowingly watched any sort of Dolby Vision or gone to like a Dolby Cinema? And if you have like a 50-person class, you usually get, a handful of hands, right? And I'll say like, okay, who has an iPhone 10 or later? And then, like 75% of the class raises their hand. And I'm like, any of you guys ever watch like your streaming services on there? And, everybody, keeps their hand up. I'm like, okay, so without even knowing it, you've been watching HDR Dolby Vision for years now, right? And this is even, permeating into things like social media. I mean, we have a ton of influence going on in that space, and we're seeing the numbers there. I mean, we have a lot of social media platforms overseas launching HDR and vision capabilities. I mean, YouTube, you can even upload on HDR and YouTube now. So like, there's a lot of cool momentum there. But to your point, Joey, I think that the thing we're seeing is that while it's accessible, I don't think a lot of people really know that they're watching it, right? Or
is that a success?
Is that a bad thing?
Yeah, I was going to say, is that
it
a
is.
kind of success of the, like if the technology means seamless, right? Instead of having somebody to think about it, they're just they go, oh, well, I got this Dolby Vision TV, I'm getting better results. That seems like a win too.
So when do we get to, if you had to put your crystal ball, when do we get to my ideal world of HDR is just the default, and we're kind of looking at SDR like we look at 4:3 safe?
That's a really good question. I'd be curious to hear Rob and David's answers to that, but I would say we're at least still another like 5 years out. I think there's a lot of hesitation in kind of the legacy creative community as well.
Sure.
I know, especially on set, is an issue that we've seen in the past, and we've tried to address that pretty directly at Dolby with a lot of our newer education initiatives and helping folks better understand how to manage HDR on set too. But I think the good news is that, again, as the displays become more accessible, the price barrier to get into HDR on set and during, content acquisition has come down quite a bit too. And I've heard a lot of, pretty high up DPs saying like, you can't really use the budget excuse anymore. Like, this is something that you should be considering. But I think that also requires like a pretty big overhaul on education as well, right? I mean, you get into any of these top echelon of film schools in the US and even overseas, like, they're teaching SDR predominantly still, right? And that needs to change to enable the next generation of content creators, right? But I think having accessibility on iPhones and social media, being able to do it, certainly helps. I don't know if Bram or Dave wants to speak to that too.
Well, I have one more thing to add before we move on to chatting with David. And I think this is kind of a question about the intersection of Bram's, sphere and your sphere, right? Bram, like the work that Dolby does as sort of I think of Dolby often as like as a research company, but they're sort of like almost like pseudo standards body, right? Because they're doing all this R&D. I mean, they're not a standards body, but you know what I'm saying? Like they do all this R&D. They're having the high level meetings with SMPTE, ITU, et cetera. I guess my question is the work that Dolby does, Nate does, et cetera, how much does that inform, kind of like some of the things that you guys do on your end, the choices that you make, the standards that you're adhering to, that kind of stuff? Because I think that, like, as Joey pointed out with Dolby, it's like, okay, cool. Like they put their badge on something, get some licensing fees and move on. But it seems to me for a company like yours, there's a lot more value behind the scenes happening with something that Dolby's doing, like that work that Dolby's doing, right? Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, what we do is, we do look to and lean on Dolby a lot for guidance on what would be a best practice, what design objectives we should be trying to strive for. I interface with Nate a ton. I think Nate and I probably speak every month or two, and just catch up about everything in the industry and try to learn about what Dolby's working on, what Dolby's interests are, how we can better facilitate content creators trying to make Dolby Vision. And I think the answer to Joey's earlier question in terms of when does it become the default, I think we can safely say that HDR will be the default when it's no longer a premium add-on for most of the streaming services. So I think when you sign up for a service and the price is just the default gives you HDR.
It's not that extra $6 a month or whatever. Yeah,
exactly. That's when we'll be there, and I think that's going to happen. It's going to be one of these things where people are like, oh, yeah, of course it needs to be HDR. So we're not quite there yet, but I think we're making huge strides in that direction. And yeah, like I said, we do lean a lot on Dolby's guidance there and try to cater to what they see as the pain points in the industry as well, within the limits of what display technology can do. But yeah, we look to them a lot for advice and guidance.
Very cool. Well, David, you have been sitting there so patiently waiting for us to chat. Thank you for that. I have to say, David, Joey and I did a like overview of calibration episode a couple weeks ago, and we released it out there. And all I could think was when we were recording was that hopefully it wasn't gonna land anywhere on your desk, and you weren't gonna see it, right? I was operating from a place of fear out of this because I have to be honest with you. You are I don't know. I mean, all of you guys are, but I consider you to be an industry giant, right? And it's just one of those things where it's just sort of like, okay, don't say anything wrong. Don't get corrected by David. Anybody who knows you realizes that you're just the sweetest guy, and that's not your MO in general. But I will say that we're really excited to have you on here because I think we definitely need to do this again with you, revisit our calibration episode because it's such a deep and complex topic, and you're one of the experts. So again, appreciate your patience, but I have some questions for you if you're willing. So I wanted to start out with you, sort of this idea of kind of the consumer versus professional landscape when it comes to calibration, right? So like, I think that in my perspective, what's exciting is that TVs are getting better, right? That the performance of TVs are vastly improved. And more importantly, so many more consumers are aware of kind of the idea of how calibration can improve their general investment, in their TV to get it looking its best. But I wanted to start out by like this idea between professional and consumer. Like when it comes to calibration and the quality of these displays, having seen 25,000 or how many ever you've calibrated, is that a tangible difference in terms of accuracy and quality between the consumer market, high-end consumer market, even let's say, and in the professional world? Are you literally getting something that's more accurate if you buy a quote unquote professional display versus a consumer display, if that makes sense?
Okay. Well, first off, thank you for having me. And I am honored to be your third guest ever.
Yeah,
on the
sure
show.
does, exactly.
It's amazing. In terms of the calibration of displays, I think a lot of that comes down to the target audience, right, and the budgets that we have. So when you look at a consumer TV manufacturer, there's only so much time they can put towards calibrating that display on the assembly line, right?
Right.
Going to that factory, because the longer they have it on that line, the less they're getting through, the higher the costs go up. And when you look at broadcast monitors in the professional market, people like FSI, they have a lot more time, right? They can put a little more time into. Of course, we also see those costs go up, right? You might be paying, I don't know, Brom, what is it, $12,000 for an XMP 310. Are you going to pay $12,000 for a 32-inch monitor in the consumer space? You're
Sure,
probably not
right.
going to be paying that kind of money. But Brom's able to maybe do a better factory calibration because he'll put a little more time and energy into that. So we do see on the pro side, most manufacturers putting in more time and energy into making sure they're getting a display to their customer that has a higher level of accuracy. The question we always have, and Brom and I talk about this all the time, is just because you got a display from even FSI doesn't mean it's set up right. And what I mean by that is it comes in one mode, right? It comes in, let's say 709. You can't
Sure.
just plug it in and start grading P3. You have to go in the menu. You have to change it to what you're working in. And so that's something that if you bring a calibrator out to your facility, we'll usually say, what's the mode you're working in? How's your system set up? Oh, you're in full range. Let me make sure this monitor is in full range, right?
Right.
So you can get a monitor from a manufacturer that might be very well calibrated, but you still have to know how to use it. And that's very,
Sure.
very important, because it doesn't matter how perfect your monitor is calibrated if it's not in parity with the signal you're sending. That ruins the whole thing. So we see that. And then on the consumer side, we do see things getting better. We see displays getting more predictable. We see technology getting more stable. So we do start to see things coming off the assembly line a little bit better. And, for Avocal, with my calibration hat on, that's not the best thing for an independent calibrator saying, hey, they're getting better off the line. Don't worry, they're not perfect yet. There's still improvement to be made, okay? He's like, don't everybody that's calibrating run. But for portrait, it's actually good because we actually make some of the technology now being used in several factories.
By those
around
TV
the world.
manufacturers, sure.
So
Yeah.
Portrait is actually working with manufacturers on the line to apply some of our technologies there. So it's good for Portrait that we're starting to get from the line. The independent calibrator, I still think it's good. I still think there's enough for the independent calibrator out there to make improvement that's noticeable.
So, David, I think one of the next questions I have is just sort of the complexity of calibration. I know when I get started, and it's something I've spoken to Brom about in the past, is that, if you're not doing this every single day, the software, the tools, et cetera, can be complicated, can be intimidating. From your perspective, like the state of calibration these days, is it still difficult? Is it something that's accessible to, a colorist like me or to an end user? Like, where does that sit? Because it seems like more and more people are aware anyway of the benefits of calibration and its need, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're taking it on themselves. Like where does that sit kind of now, with modern tools and modern software?
I think calibration has gotten more difficult and at the same time easier in a lot of ways. It's kind of hard to explain. So when I started calibrating, it was CRTs.
Right.
And we would even open up the CRT and take the glare screen off. You had the Fresnel lenticular and you had the glare screen. You take the glare screen off so you could have that matte finish. You wouldn't have this huge reflection because 25 years ago those were pretty obtrusive glare screens. They're not like some of what we have today with modern displays. And we turn the trim pots and we'd maybe do focus on the CRTs and then spend hours doing convergence. And you might have convergence for all these memories. So you have a lot of physical stuff that happened years ago, but you only had so many adjustments when it came to dialing, let's say, your grayscale, and you might have had cuts and gains. You might have only had choose a gamma. There was no tracking in EOTF or doing a 1D lookup table.
And I feel like in those days they fought each other a lot more, right? It was you change you change pedestal, and then everything else kind of needs to be. It's a lot more dialing one thing in and then dialing another thing back to compensate.
Absolutely. And so you'd go back and forth, and you'd have very few actual controls of the image compared to today, but you'd have a lot of physical stuff you could do that would really, really improve the image. So that combined into a really great image when you were done calibrating. Today, there's almost no physical adjustments on a lot of these flat panels, right? You have physical adjustments on projectors, but you don't really have it on these flat panels. But now you have very complicated image processing paths where you can do 1D lookup tables, 3D lookup tables. You can do different EOTF tracking. You can there's just so much you can do. And then you add into the complexity. Back then, it was really one calibration you were doing, whether that was for SIMP-DC or BT709. Now you're calibrating for SDR, HDR, and often Dolby Vision. So now you have 3 calibrations in that one calibration session, and that just makes the complexity that other level. Now, we also didn't have software like CalMan, I shouldn't say 20 years ago, because 20 years ago, CalMan came out, and we're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year. But 22 years ago, we didn't have CalMan to make things easy. So now with the software that we have and the software tools that are out there in the marketplace, it is much easier to quantify a display, understand what the display is doing, and make those decisions, and they can help guide you through that process to success. So even though they've gotten more complicated from a display adjustment standpoint and an image processing standpoint, the software has tried to keep up with helping users achieve their success with that calibration process.
Yeah,
so I think
that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's getting easier. I think we're getting easier, and we're going to keep trying to make it easier over time.
So another thing that pops to mind is when it comes to calibration is that I think, like anything else, there seems to be levels to this, right? I mean, just take a look at some of the hardware, right? There's, go to the old Apple store and buy a little, cheap, relatively cheap colorimeter, put it on the monitor. Bob's your uncle. But then there's, $10,000, $20,000 was how important is the level or quality of gear, specifically when it comes to meters, in pattern generators, the hardware aspect of this for achieving success, right? I think a lot of people, I know Joey and I talked to a ton of colorists that go, yeah, cool. I know calibration's important, but it's not $20,000 important to me, right? Like, are there good results that can be had somewhere in the middle? Like, speak to that a little bit, because it seems like there's just a lot of variability in terms of cost and functionality when it comes to some of this gear.
Yeah, so this is the question the geeks get into, which is how accurate is accurate enough?
Right.
And as you go up in equipment capability, right, when you get into some of these higher end laboratory grade colorimeters and spectroradiometers, you get a higher level of precision, right, in those measurements. You get a higher level of repeatability, precision. You get a little more confidence that what you're measuring is going to be accurate based on, maybe it has a 2 nanometer bandwidth on a spectro versus a 10 nanometer bandwidth on a different spectro. But a colorimeter and even a low-cost device can be quite accurate if it's profiled, what we call profiled, or has a correction table, right, for that specific display. So we're starting to see more of that happen at Portrait, right, where we have our C6 HDR 5000 colorimeter, and we have a lab now that we build profiles for our customers, for CalMan, in there. So if you have a profile, you can get a really good result in comparison to, say, a $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 spectrometer. If you don't have a profile, you're going to have a little more error in that reading, right? And how much that's going to be is going to be dependent on how far off the profile you're using is. So you could have a generic WRGB OLED profile, might be really great on Model A, but Model B has a different type of panel. Maybe it's an MLA panel, and you're going to have a larger error because you're using a profile from one for another. Once you get that calibration of the probe out of the way, then it starts to become down, what's the capability of the probe itself? So if you're working on a monitor that say has a really great black level, quantum dot OLED, WRGB OLED, the JOLED panels we saw on some of the monitors, like the LG 32 EP950, those go pretty darn close to black, if not perfect black. And if you're trying to calibrate a 1D lookup table, how low can you measure with your meter and get a reliable reading? And that starts to become really important with these. So, if you're calibrating a monitor that only has gains and bias, maybe you don't care that you can't measure 0.05 nits because you can't adjust it. If you can't adjust it, you might not care. But if you can adjust it, and then you're using that probe, and it just can't measure accurately down there, well, you're going to increase your error. So
Understood.
I guess to answer your question, I think there's some really great low-cost colorimeters on the market. And if you know the limitations of those products, if you know what they can do and what you might be fighting against in terms of getting that ultimate accuracy, they're just fine. And then if you want to go up that next level to those higher-end probes, you just get that confidence. It's that confidence game Bram was telling you about. You're going to get that confidence that, hey, I know I've got a probe. It's lab grade. It's right. I can measure anything with this. And I know I'm going to get the same result.
So
I mean, I often think about calibration as like the truth, right? So like that makes a lot of sense. That sort of, the more accurate you can be, the more truth that you're seeing. I guess the question, sort of a part B to that is, so like, is that difference between using higher end gear and entry level gear, is it enough to be a noticeable difference to the the person looking at that monitor, or is this a case of, no, we're getting this prettier, nicer graphs kind of thing, and like, but visually it doesn't really matter. Like, I think a lot of people debate that, whether it's something they can.
Robbie loves to chase pretty calibration graphs.
I do like a pretty graph. Yeah. That is for sure. That is for sure. And
Dave and I have used, I think, for as long as we've known each other, is degrees of accuracy. Accuracy is a binary accurate or inaccurate thing when it comes to calibration. It's all about degrees of accuracy, and that is a sliding scale with a lot of steps in between.
No, I agree with that, Bram. I think that, for a user like me who admittedly has a level of OCD that a lot of people don't have, I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations with Bram, sometimes very late at night, being like, all right, man, well, I'm nervous because 0.7 seems high versus 0.6. I'd really like it to be 0.6, that kind of thing. And he walks me off a ledge. But I think that, that's a consideration that people have. Like, if I'm going to invest all that much money, am I really getting something that's tangibly different in terms of what I'm seeing on the display?
It comes down to, again, I think what you're trying to do with it, right? So if I try to take a lower cost colorimeter and I calibrate an LG OLED, for example, and I've done this, I've actually done this myself to see the same difference you're talking about. My coming out of black on that LG OLED will be a little different than if I take, say, my CR100 and I do it. And I can see that if I look at a pattern, like if I look at a shallow gray ramp, or I look at, maybe something really dark off like Spears and Munsell, and I can say, oh, look, I can see a little difference between these two images. For a consumer, how dramatic is that? Probably not super dramatic. For a colorist and a content creator that's, nitpicking every little thing, it's probably going to be the end of the world. Because having worked with a lot of colorists, we'll see, oh, the shadow doesn't quite match in this scene on this monitor versus that monitor, and you go, oh, well, I need to change this. But we don't see many pro calibrators using some of these lower end probes. And one of those things, and this is something Bram and I have talked about recently, and I'm tempted to just try and get this new meter from Minolta that's super fast. And what I was going to say is, we don't see a lot of pros using these probes if they're calibrating as a service like Avocal is, because they take a long time, right? So when you spend more money, you often get a little more sensitivity, you get a little more speed, right? So your CR100, your Klein, your Minolta CA527, they're going to be a lot faster. So you can achieve the calibration much quicker, and so time starts to become money. But you're not only getting that speed, you're also getting that increase in precision from these devices. So it's kind of a win-win if you're doing it as a business, to invest in that better gear and get in, get out faster, along with those better results.
Makes sense.
So I think again, if you're in that pro level, it's worth having that consistency and that accuracy and whatnot from these higher probes. But if you're in the consumer world, yeah, the lower cost probes that are on the market are doing a great job. And I think the most important thing for me is making sure, one, you have a meter profile for the type of display you want to measure. And
Yep.
two, making sure it's adequate for the display you want to measure. You
Sure.
wouldn't buy a probe that only does 1,000 nits if you're trying to calibrate a 3,000 nit monitor.
Yeah, obviously.
If you know you're building a LUT that goes near black, you want to make sure that your probe can measure near black. And so
Makes sense.
those considerations start to become less as you go up in the tiers, because a lot of these higher end probes can measure really wide dynamic ranges, and you don't have to think about it as much.
And one last one for you before we wrap up this part of our discussion with you guys. I think one other question is that so I buy a display and it comes, it says, oh hey, it's been calibrated at the factory, right? So I'm trusting that to a certain degree, but I think people know that, hey, I live with the display for a year or so, like I need to recalibrate it. In your opinion, like what's the recalibration process, like the necessity of it, right? Like how often should somebody be going, hey, I need to, validate or recalibrate this display? Can you put a number on it? Is it every quarter? Is it every, 6 months? Like, is there a time demarcation, or is it more of just, hey, that's a personal preference, do it whenever you feel like doing it to reassure yourself?
This comes down sort of to the customer, right? So we have customers that are all over the place. When you think about a home user, we have some customers that'll call up a calibrator or recalibrate themselves every 6 to 12 months.
Mhm.
Realistically, at Avocal, I tell my customers about every 18 months if you're a home user. Well, averaging about 3 hours a day, figure they're putting
Yeah.
on around 1,500 hours. It's going to have drifted. It has some aging. Let's bring that back in. When you start getting into content creators, you start looking at displays that are being used 40, 50, 60 hours a week. And so at that point, it also comes down to, are you using it 40 hours a week in HDR, or are you using it 40 hours a week in SDR? Our general rule of thumb is about every 6 months for a colorist and about
Okay.
once a year for an editor. Yeah, the editor's monitor is going to drift, but if they're not really doing serious color timing and color grading at the end, then they can let it drift a little longer if they want. We did an experiment with the studio a few years ago where we were coming out every quarter for about a year, and we were quantifying some broadcast monitors, and we were quantifying the LG OLEDs that were on the wall. And what we found was the LGs were drifting in the quarter a little more than the broadcast monitors, right? The broadcast monitors were staying much more stable over that amount of time. And what we came up with is about every 6 months is probably pretty good for this particular studio, where they're not really seeing a difference in parity between the broadcast monitor and the LG until about that 6 months point. And the goal is, I stress this to all your listeners, try to get ahead of it, right? The point of recalibration, the point of making sure you stay dialed in is so that you don't end up with the fire drill. Because once the client sees something and you start getting notes, or you start getting someone in your bay questioning, then it becomes the fire drill. And then it's, oh, we need someone here right away, and we need to go
Oh
through
yeah,
this,
and
then we might need to
there's
upgrade it.
loss of trust, like all sorts of issues involved in it.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, so we try to keep up with our customers, or at least at Avocal, we try to keep up with our customers. Every 6 to 8 months, we'll send reminders out to our studio customers and say, hey, it's been about this long. Are you interested in setting up a recalibration appointment? Some of them do it like clockwork. Some of them wait until the project's over. Maybe it's another season. We have a lot of TV shows we work on where they'll do it every season, and they'll just say, it's good for the season. But again, that 6 to 8 months is usually pretty good for a studio, and I'd say about every 18 months to 2 years for a consumer is pretty decent for most people.
Awesome. Well, I think I have some more questions, but I tell you what, let's hold off on those additional questions for all three of you for a part 2, because we have a lot more to ask you, a lot more to dive in. But hopefully this gives everybody sort of a high level overview of kind of how these sort of disparate parts, in these guys' sort of roles in the display industry kind of gel together, from display manufacturing to validation and kind of standards to actually, the technical part of getting to make sure that these displays are as accurate as possible with calibration. Very cool stuff, guys. But hopefully you'll you'll stick with us for another part where we'll fire some rapid fire questions off for you. As a reminder for any of our viewers, you can always head over to offsetpodcast.com and get some show notes. We'll definitely have some show notes for these episodes. You can always follow us on social media, on Instagram or Facebook. Just search for the Offset Podcast. And you can find us on all major streaming platforms as well as YouTube. Just search for the Offset Podcast. All right, so stay tuned for a part 2. Very big thanks to all 3 of our guests for joining us on this episode, but we'll be back in just a little bit for part 2 and diving into more depth. So for the Offset Podcast, I'm Robbie Carmen.
And I'm Joey Diana. Thanks for listening.